"Guilty, Your Honor," the disheveled black man mumbled, his voice unexpectedly dignified despite his appearance. "I was hungry." Laughter rippled through courtroom 302. The prosecutor smirked. "Another homeless case, another day? State your full name for the record," the clerk demanded. "Brayton Elijah Green, former Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." Judge William Harrison's pen stopped mid-signature. His head snapped up, eyes widening as they truly focused on the defendant for the first time. The blood drained from his face. "Staff Sergeant Brayton Green," he repeated, voice barely audible. The courtroom fell silent as the judge suddenly stood, a breach of protocol that startled even the bailiff. "Court will take a 30-minute recess," he announced, hands visibly trembling. "The defendant will remain." As the judge disappeared into his chambers, whispers erupted throughout the gallery. Only Brayton remained still, eyes fixed on the floor, unaware that his name had just changed everything. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Drop your city. Have you ever witnessed someone being dismissed based solely on their appearance, only to discover they were extraordinary? How often do our prejudices blind us to the heroes walking among us? Share your thoughts while we uncover Brayton Green's remarkable story. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge perceptions and reveal the hidden truths about racial justice. Brayton Elijah Green had been a fixture in Harlem for 7 years, though most people didn't know his name. To shop owners along 125th Street, he was just that homeless vet. A tall, dignified man who never panhandled, never caused trouble, but was unwelcome nonetheless. He slept in different doorways each night, careful never to linger too long in one spot. Unlike other homeless individuals who sought attention or handouts, Brayton kept to himself, collecting recyclables and occasionally accepting leftovers from sympathetic restaurant workers who recognized the military bearing he maintained despite his circumstances. What those passers-by didn't know was that Brayton Green had once commanded respect wherever he went. For 22 years, he had served in the United States Marine Corps with distinction, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. The faded tattoo on his right forearm, Semper Fidelis, was now barely visible beneath layers of dirt, much like his identity had been buried beneath years of systematic neglect. Standing 6'3" with broad shoulders that still maintained a hint of their former power, Brayton had once led a platoon through some of the most dangerous territories in Helmand Province. In 2009, his quick thinking and extraordinary courage during an ambush saved 17 Marines, earning him the Silver Star and a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. Green leads from the front and leaves no one behind, his commanding officer had written. His moral compass never wavers, even when conventional wisdom suggests retreat. That moral compass had guided Brayton through firefights and reconnaissance missions. It had steadied his hand when extracting wounded comrades under enemy fire. But it offered little direction when, after his honorable discharge in 2015, he found himself fighting an entirely different kind of battle, one against a system that seemed designed to fail men who looked like him. In those early days of civilian life, Brayton had returned to the small Bronx apartment he shared with his wife, Lisa. Their marriage had weathered his deployments, sustained by love letters and brief video calls. Lisa, a kindergarten teacher with a smile that could illuminate the darkest corners of Brayton's combat memories, had been his anchor to humanity during the worst moments overseas. "You come back to me whole, Brayton Green," she had written in every letter. "This world still needs your light." But the light in their world dimmed quickly when Lisa began experiencing severe abdominal pain in late 2015. What began as occasional discomfort escalated to agony within weeks. Brayton took her to the emergency room 3 times. Each visit, they waited hours longer than white patients with similar symptoms. Each time, different doctors dismissed her pain as probably just fibroids or likely stress-related. "Maybe try some over-the-counter pain relievers and rest," one doctor suggested, barely making eye contact with either of them. By the time a young resident finally ordered proper tests 4 months later, the cancer had spread from Lisa's ovaries to her liver and lungs. Terminal. 6 months at most. If they had found this sooner. The resident had begun before catching herself. Brayton didn't need her to finish. He knew. They both knew. Lisa's death sentence had been written in the dismissive glances, the skepticism about her pain, the inexplicable lost referrals to specialists, a familiar pattern to any black person navigating America's healthcare system. Lisa declined rapidly. The strong woman who had taught kindergartners to read for 15 years now struggled to lift a glass of water. Brayton became her full-time caregiver, draining their modest savings for medications that merely dulled her pain rather than offering hope. Apply for your VA benefits, Lisa urged during a rare lucid moment. You've earned them. We need them now. Brayton nodded, though he already sensed the mountain he would have to climb. The next morning, leaving Lisa in the care of her sister, he made his first visit to the regional VA office. What followed was an exercise in institutionalized frustration. Forms disappeared after submission. Appointments were scheduled, then canceled without notice. Critical documents were declared insufficient, without clear explanation of what would suffice. Each visit, Brayton noticed the white veterans moving through the system with relative ease while he and other veterans of color languished in administrative purgatory. Your combat records seem incomplete, a clerk told him after his fourth visit. And there's a question about your discharge status. My discharge was honorable, Brayton replied, pushing forward his paperwork. And I submitted complete records last month. The clerk shrugged. System doesn't show that. You'll need to start over with these forms. Meanwhile, Lisa's condition deteriorated. The morphine barely touched her pain now. Their savings evaporated into medical bills and overpriced prescriptions. Brayton sold their car, then his watch, a retirement gift from his unit. Nothing was too precious if it bought Lisa more comfort. On a rain-soaked Tuesday in October 2016, Lisa drew her final breath, her hand clasped tightly in Brayton's. Her last words to him, "Don't let this break your spirit. Someone still needs your light." But the light within Brayton had begun to flicker. The man who had led Marines through gunfire now found himself unable to navigate the bureaucratic minefield that prevented him from accessing the benefits he'd earned through blood and sacrifice. Each rejection letter, each dismissive interaction chipped away at the foundation of his resilience. 3 months after Lisa's funeral, Brayton received an eviction notice. Without her teacher's salary and with his benefits still in administrative limbo, rent had become impossible. He pawned his Silver Star medal, the recognition of his battlefield courage now exchanged for 2 months' rent. When that ran out, he slept in his car until it was repossessed. Then came the park benches, the shelters when he could tolerate their dangers, and finally, the doorways of Harlem. The same country that had sent him overseas to fight for freedom had now relegated him to society's shadows. The same system that had once outfitted him with $80,000 in tactical gear couldn't provide him with health care or housing. The same citizens who claimed to support our troops now crossed the street to avoid walking near him. It's not just being homeless, Brayton confided to a fellow veteran he met at a soup kitchen. It's being invisible until someone decides you're a threat. Then suddenly, you're hypervisible for all the wrong reasons. That pattern of invisibility and hypervisibility defined Brayton's existence on the streets. Store owners who ignored his polite greetings would suddenly find their attention sharply focused on him if he spent too long browsing their merchandise. Police officers who drove past him sleeping in the park would abruptly stop and demand identification if he sat on a bench in a more affluent neighborhood. The PTSD symptoms he had managed to control with Lisa's help now resurged with vengeance. Backfiring cars sent him diving for cover. Fireworks triggered night terrors that left him screaming in alleyways. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat now prevented him from using crowded shelters where he couldn't watch all entrances simultaneously. One particularly brutal winter night in 2019, when temperatures dropped to single digits, Brayton finally attempted to access emergency VA services. The intake nurse eyed his ragged appearance with thinly veiled disgust. "We're going to need multiple forms of ID," she stated, though the white veteran ahead of him had been processed with just a driver's license. "My military ID is all I have left," Brayton explained, producing the weathered card. She examined it with suspicion. This could be anyone's. We've had people try to use stolen valor to get services before. 22 years, ma'am. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star recipient. I can recite my service number backward if that helps, Brayton replied, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. We'll still need additional documentation and proof of address, she insisted. Brayton's laugh held no humor. My address is the corner of 125th and Lexington. Northeast doorway when it's dry, subway station when it rains. He was escorted out by security minutes later. That night, huddled in a cardboard shelter of his own making, something broke inside Staff Sergeant Brayton Green. The unrelenting cold seemed to crystallize a realization. The country he had sacrificed everything to protect had no place for him. The system wasn't merely broken, it was functioning exactly as designed, filtering out those deemed unworthy based on factors beyond their control. As frostbite began to numb his extremities, Brayton made a decision that ran counter to everything he had ever been taught. For the first time in his life, he would stop fighting. Not out of weakness, but out of the recognition that some battlefields offered no possibility of victory. The decorated Marine who had once led men into combat surrendered to a different kind of enemy, a systemic indifference that had proven more formidable than any adversary he had faced abroad. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you look or where you live? Has society ever made you invisible when you deserve to be seen? Share your experience in the comments. And if Brayton's story has touched you so far, subscribe to our channel where we bring these hidden truths to light. No one should be forgotten after serving their country, especially because of the color of their skin. Life on Harlem's streets hardened Brayton in ways that combat never had. In war, the enemy was clear. Here, danger wore 1,000 faces, sometimes uniformed, sometimes not. His daily routine became a careful choreography of survival. Wake before dawn to avoid the morning patrol that ticketed vagrants. Visit the public library bathroom to wash up before the security guard who particularly disliked him started his shift. Collect bottles and cans in neighborhoods where he wouldn't be immediately reported as suspicious. Find food that wouldn't make him sick. You knew around here, a voice had asked him during his first month on the streets. It belonged to Calvin, an older homeless veteran who recognized the military posture Brayton couldn't shake. Marines? Calvin had asked, noticing Brayton's tattoo. 22 years, Brayton nodded. Calvin shook his head. Then you better learn quick. Being black, homeless, and a vet is 3 strikes. Cops see you as a threat, civilians see you as a failure, and the VA sees you as paperwork they don't want to process. Calvin taught Brayton the unwritten rules of survival. Which shelter staff could be trusted, which store owners would call police if you lingered too long, which public bathrooms were least likely to be monitored, which churches genuinely helped, and which just wanted the appearance of charity. Most important rule, Calvin had warned, never look a cop in the eye. They take it as a challenge. Despite these lessons, Brayton couldn't avoid the constant profiling. In his first year on the streets, he was stopped and questioned 17 times. His belongings searched 11 times, and detained overnight 3 times. Always released without charges, but with his few possessions often misplaced during processing. Fitting the description became a phrase he heard so often it lost all meaning. The description was simply, black, male, homeless. Sir, we've had reports of someone suspicious in the area. An officer would begin, hand already resting on his weapon though Brayton made no threatening moves. Just passing through, Brayton would respond, eyes downcast, using the deferential tone he'd never needed in 2 decades as a decorated Marine. Gonna need some ID, would come the inevitable demand, followed by radio checks for warrants, suspicious glances at his military ID, this really you? And the standard warning to move along. One evening in 2020, Brayton was collecting cans near a row of upscale apartments when he noticed a young woman on her phone, watching him nervously from her doorway. 30 minutes later, 2 police cars arrived. As officers approached, Brayton placed his hands clearly in view, a survival instinct now. Someone called about a man looking into windows. One officer stated, hand on holster. Just collecting recycling, sir, Brayton replied, gesturing to his bag of cans. Let's see some ID, demanded the second officer, already reaching for handcuffs. As Brayton carefully reached for his worn military ID, a third officer approached, younger, black, with a name tag reading Terrell. The officer paused, studied Brayton's posture, and stepped forward. Marine Corps, right? Officer Terrell asked. Brayton nodded. My brother's force recon, Terrell continued. I can spot that bearing anywhere. The dynamic shifted subtly. Officer Terrell turned to his colleagues. I've got this one. After the others withdrew, Terrell lowered his voice. Look, man, this neighborhood has a lot of calls about suspicious persons. Usually means black men who don't look like they live here. Brayton met his eyes. I'm just trying to make enough for a meal. Terrell glanced at his watch. St. Anthony's Shelter has beds available tonight. Decent place, less hassle than most. He hesitated, then pressed $20 into Brayton's palm. Get somewhere warm. Too many brothers dying on these streets. That rare moment of humanity stood in stark contrast to Brayton's typical interactions with authority. More often, he was treated as inherently criminal, his homelessness and race combining to make him perpetually suspect. The incident that eventually led to his courtroom appearance occurred on a bitter January morning in 2023. After 3 days without food, Brayton spotted restaurant staff placing bags of day-old bread in a dumpster behind Riverside Market. The manager had previously chased him away, but today, no one was watching. Brayton retrieved 2 loaves that were still in sealed packages. As he turned to leave, a security guard appeared. Hey, that's stealing. It's trash, Brayton responded, gesturing to the dumpster. They threw it away. It's private property, the guard insisted, already calling the police. And you're trespassing. When officers arrived, they didn't bother with questions. One officer immediately secured Brayton's hands behind his back, while the other photographed the evidence, 2 loaves of discarded bread. Petty theft and trespassing. They informed him as they placed him in the patrol car. At the precinct, Brayton was processed like any other criminal, fingerprinted, photographed, his meager possessions placed in a plastic bag. The holding cell was freezing, the concrete bench offering no comfort as he waited nearly 24 hours for his court appearance. Public defenders here, an officer eventually announced, unlocking the cell. The lawyer who met with Brayton looked barely old enough to have passed the bar. She rifled through his file for exactly 2 minutes before speaking. Simple case. Plead guilty. You'll probably get time served since it's just bread. Though with your priors for loitering. Those weren't convictions, Brayton interrupted. I was detained and released. She waved dismissively. Same difference to the court. Look, I've got 27 cases today. Plead guilty, and you'll be out by afternoon. Fight it, and you could be in holding for weeks waiting for a trial date. Brayton considered his options. Fight for principle and remain imprisoned, or concede to expediency and return to the harsh freedom of the streets. I'll take the guilty plea, he said finally. Smart choice, she replied, already gathering her papers, his case mentally closed. Have you ever noticed how differently people are treated based on appearances? How quickly assumptions are made about character based on circumstances? What would happen if we looked beyond the surface to see the true person? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their situation, subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge our perceptions and expose the reality of racial injustice. Courtroom 302 of the Manhattan Criminal Court was designed to process cases rapidly, not deliver justice thoughtfully. On the morning of Brayton's hearing, the gallery held the usual mix of worried family members, bored law students, and attorneys waiting for their cases to be called. As Brayton was let in, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, now wrinkled from a night in holding, several spectators visibly recoiled, some shifting away as though homelessness might be contagious. Case number 47-392, State versus Brayton Green. The clerk announced monotonously. The young prosecutor stood, straightening his tie. Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing food from Riverside Market. Given his prior incidents of loitering and trespassing, We recommend continued detention until a full hearing. Judge William Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, the case already mentally classified as routine. Another homeless defendant, another quick guilty plea, another day in court. Mr. Green, how do you plead? The judge asked, his tone suggesting the answer was a mere formality. Guilty, Your Honor, Brayton replied, his voice carrying the remnants of command presence despite his circumstances. I was hungry. Someone in the back row snickered. Another whispered something that made their companion laugh. The prosecutor's mouth twitched in a suppressed smile. The judge frowned at the disruption but didn't reprimand the gallery. Instead, he returned to the paperwork, ready to process this case like the dozens before it. State your full name and identification for the record, the clerk instructed. Brayton straightened his posture slightly, muscle memory from decades of military discipline. Brayton Elijah Green, former Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, Service Number 547-9238. Judge Harrison's pen froze mid-signature. The courtroom continued its usual murmur, but the judge had gone completely still, color draining from his face as he slowly raised his head to truly look at the defendant for the first time. Staff Sergeant Brayton Green, he repeated, his voice barely audible. The courtroom fell silent as the judge abruptly stood, a breach of protocol that startled even the bailiff. Court will take a 30-minute recess, Judge Harrison announced, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. The defendant will remain. As the judge disappeared into his chambers, whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. The prosecutor looked bewildered. Brayton's public defender, who had been checking her phone during the proceedings, finally looked up in confusion. What just happened? She asked Brayton. He shook his head slightly. I don't know. But somewhere deep in his memory, something stirred, a half-forgotten name, a face obscured by desert sand and time. In his private chambers, Judge William Harrison's hands trembled as he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. From beneath legal texts and personal documents, he withdrew a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. The polished mahogany bore the Marine Corps emblem, a gift from his unit upon his medical discharge in 2009. Inside lay a Purple Heart medal, a folded American flag, and a photograph protected in plastic. With unsteady fingers, the judge removed the photograph. 5 Marines in combat gear standing before a medical evacuation helicopter in Afghanistan's Helmand province. His younger self stood in the center, arm in a sling, eyes squinting against the desert sun. But it was the tall figure on the far right that commanded his attention now. Staff Sergeant Brayton Green, standing at parade rest, his expression serious beneath the protective helmet. Judge Harrison sank into his chair, memories flooding back with physical force. Helmand Province, July 2009. Then Lieutenant Harrison had been attached to a Marine unit as a field surgeon. Their convoy, returning from a medical mission in a remote village, had been ambushed by Taliban fighters. The lead vehicle hit an IED, the explosion flipping it onto its side. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Harrison had been tending to the wounded driver when a bullet tore through his shoulder, sending him sprawling onto the dusty road. As blood soaked his uniform and consciousness began to fade, he remembered strong arms lifting him. A voice, commanding despite the chaos, "I've got you, Lieutenant. Stay with me." Through waves of pain and the haze of blood loss, he recalled being carried across open terrain, the steady stride of his rescuer never faltering despite ongoing gunfire. The Marine had used his own body as a shield, covering Harrison as they moved through exposed areas. Later, in the field hospital, Harrison learned that Staff Sergeant Green had carried him over 2 miles to the extraction point, refusing medical attention for his own wounds until Harrison had been evacuated. The official report stated, Staff Sergeant Green's extraordinary courage under fire directly resulted in saving Lieutenant Harrison's life. Despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to his leg and back, Green carried the injured officer through active enemy territory, exposing himself to continuous danger rather than waiting for reinforcements. For years after his medical discharge, Harrison had attempted to locate the Marine who saved his life. But military records provided limited information, and Green had apparently left the service without maintaining connections to veterans groups. Eventually, the search faded amid the demands of law school and his subsequent judicial career. Now, 14 years later, that same Marine stood in his courtroom, homeless, hungry, and treated with contempt by the very system Harrison represented. The judge placed the photograph on his desk and opened his computer. With rapid keystrokes, he accessed the secure military database his judicial position still gave him clearance to view. Brayton Elijah Green's service record appeared on screen, confirming what the photograph suggested. 22 years of exemplary service. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star recipient. Combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Honorable discharge in 2015. The file contained numerous commendations, including one with Harrison's own signature, written from his hospital bed before being transported back to Germany for surgery. A more recent addition to the file caught the judge's attention, a VA benefits application from 2016, marked pending. Additional documentation required. Subsequent notations showed the application perpetually stalled in bureaucratic limbo, never approved but never officially denied, a common administrative tactic that disproportionately affected veterans of color. "My God," Judge Harrison whispered, running a hand over his face. "While I've been sitting on this bench passing judgment." He thought of the man in his courtroom, not as the disheveled defendant he'd barely glanced at earlier, but as the Marine who had carried him to safety, who had shielded him with his own body, who had given him the chance to live the life he now enjoyed. The stark contrast between that memory and the present reality struck Harrison with the force of physical pain. Here was a man who had saved countless lives, including his own, reduced to stealing discarded bread to survive. Here was a decorated Marine being mocked in open court for the crime of hunger. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Your Honor, the recess is almost over. The court is waiting." Harrison straightened, decision already forming. "Tell the bailiff to clear the courtroom except for the defendant and his attorney. And contact the VA liaison office immediately. I need Gregory Winters here within the hour." "Sir?" his clerk questioned, confusion evident in her voice. "This isn't just another case," Judge Harrison replied, gathering the photograph and service record. "This is a debt that can never be fully repaid, but I'm damn well going to start trying. What happens when we truly see people for who they are, not what circumstances have made them appear to be? How might our world change if we looked beyond our initial judgments?" Find out how Judge Harrison confronts his own biases and the system he represents in the conclusion of Brayton Green's powerful story. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the final chapter of this journey toward justice and recognition. As Judge William Harrison prepared to return to the courtroom, a battle raged within him. The man who had sworn to uphold justice now faced the stark reality that the system he represented had failed someone to whom he owed his very life. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "Your Honor," his clerk interrupted his thoughts, "the VA liaison is here. And there's someone else, a Colonel Jefferson Davis from the Marine Corps. Says he drove in from Quantico when he heard about Staff Sergeant Green." Harrison nodded, composing himself. "Send them both in." When the door opened, a distinguished black man in full-dress uniform entered alongside the VA representative. Colonel Davis's chest displayed rows of service ribbons that commanded immediate respect. "Judge Harrison," the colonel said, extending his hand. "Thank you for the call. Brayton Green served under my command in Afghanistan. One of the finest Marines I've ever known." "You knew him well?" Harrison asked. "Knew him? Sir, there's a training center at Quantico with his picture on the wall. His extraction technique during the Helmand ambush is taught to every officer candidate." The colonel's expression darkened. "When your clerk said he was homeless, I couldn't believe it. The system failed him," Harrison said simply. "No," Colonel Davis corrected, "we failed him. And I intend to correct that today." Have you ever witnessed a moment when privilege and power were used not to punish, but to restore? When someone with authority chose justice over procedure? Those rare moments remind us what's possible when we truly see each other's humanity. Share a time when you saw true justice in action. And if you believe in the power of these stories to change hearts and systems, subscribe now to support our mission of bringing hidden truths to light. When court reconvened, the gallery had been cleared except for Colonel Davis, the VA liaison, and a few court officers. Brayton remained at the defense table, his public defender now fully alert, sensing the unusual nature of the proceedings. Judge Harrison entered without the usual announcement, his judicial robe replaced by a simple suit. This was no longer Judge Harrison presiding. This was William Harrison, the man, addressing a debt that transcended legal proceedings. "This court is now in session," Harrison began, his voice carrying unusual emotion. "But before we continue with the case against Mr. Green, I am recusing myself from these proceedings." Murmurs of confusion filled the small gathering. The prosecutor looked bewildered. "I cannot ethically preside over this case," Harrison continued, "because I have a personal connection to the defendant, one that I was unaware of until today." Harrison stepped down from the bench and approached Brayton directly. "Staff Sergeant Green," he said, using the military title deliberately. 14 years ago in Helmand Province, you carried a wounded lieutenant 2 miles through enemy territory to an evacuation point. That lieutenant was me." The silence in the courtroom grew profound. Brayton's eyes, which had remained downcast throughout the proceedings, slowly lifted to study the judge's face. Recognition dawned gradually, the features older, the desert tan long faded, but the eyes unmistakable. "You were just a kid," Brayton said softly, his first words since stating his name. "I was 26, Harrison replied, "and I would have died there if not for you." The prosecutor, witnessing this exchange, rose hesitantly. "Your Honor, Judge Harrison, in light of these circumstances, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Green." "Motion granted." Harrison nodded, though the legal proceeding had become secondary to the human one unfolding. Colonel Davis stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Green, I've reviewed your service record and benefit application history. There has been a grievous administrative error, one that reflects a pattern where finding disproportionately affects veterans of color." He handed Brayton a folder. "Inside you'll find documentation of all benefits owed to you since 2016, including housing allowance, medical coverage, and pension payments. The total exceeds $387,000 in back payments, which will be disbursed immediately. A formal apology from the Department of Veterans Affairs is included, signed by the Secretary himself." Brayton stared at the folder but made no move to open it. After 7 years of being treated as invisible, the sudden recognition seemed surreal, almost suspicious. "Why now?" he asked simply. "What changed today that couldn't have happened years ago?" The question hung in the air, its implications damning. No one had a satisfactory answer because the truth was painfully obvious. Nothing had changed except that Brayton was now seen as someone worthy of attention, not because he was a decorated veteran or a human being in need, but because someone with power recognized him personally. Harrison broke the uncomfortable silence. "Nothing changed that shouldn't have changed the first day you applied for benefits. The system failed you because it was designed to work exactly as it did, to create obstacles, to presume unworthiness, to filter out those deemed undeserving based on factors that should never matter." He gestured to the courtroom around them. "I've been part of that system, processing cases without seeing the people behind them. Today, that changes, not just for you, but for how this court operates going forward." The VA liaison, a thin man with nervous hands, stepped forward. "Mr. Green, we've arranged immediate housing at the veterans' residence on 125th Street. Medical services are available beginning today, and a case manager has been assigned specifically to ensure no further administrative issues." "Issues," Brayton repeated, the word inadequate for the systematic erasure he had experienced. "Is that what we're calling it?" Colonel Davis intervened. "We're calling it what it is, Staff Sergeant. Institutional racism embedded in a system that claims to be colorblind while consistently producing discriminatory outcomes. That's why I've been appointed to the Secretary's new task force examining racial disparities in veteran benefit accessibility." He met Brayton's eyes directly. Your case isn't unique. Our preliminary review shows black veterans wait, on average, 37% longer for benefit approvals and are 42% more likely to have applications marked incomplete without clear explanation. We need your help changing that. For the first time since entering the courtroom, something shifted in Brayton's expression, a flicker of the leader he had once been, the man who had carried others through danger without hesitation. How, he asked simply. By telling your story, the colonel replied. By helping us identify where and how the system creates these disparities. By being part of the solution. As the proceedings concluded, Harrison approached Brayton privately. There's something else, he said, reaching into his pocket. I found this while researching your case. He held out a small velvet box. Inside lay a silver star medal, identical to the one Brayton had pawned years ago to pay rent after Lisa's death. I tracked it down at West Side Pawn, Harrison explained. The owner remembered you. Said it was the most difficult transaction he'd ever processed because you kept polishing it before handing it over. Brayton's weathered hands trembled slightly as he took the box. Lisa made me promise to keep it shining, he said quietly. Said it wasn't just my medal. It belonged to every Marine who served alongside me. The judge nodded. I have a car waiting outside. No cameras, no reporters. Just a chance to start rebuilding what never should have been torn down. As they exited the courtroom through a private door, Brayton paused. That day in Helmand, you said something to me while I was carrying you. Do you remember? Harrison smiled. I told you to leave me and save yourself. Standard protocol when resources are limited. And I told you, no man left behind isn't just a saying. It's a promise, Harrison finished. I never forgot those words. They're why I became a judge, to ensure no one gets left behind by our justice system. Brayton's expression remained serious. Then you've been failing, Judge. Every day in that courtroom, people who look like me get left behind. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? The challenge hung between them. Not accusatory but necessary. Not bitter but honest. Start by seeing people, not cases, Brayton continued. Lisa used to say, justice without compassion is just procedure. I've had plenty of procedure. What this country needs is justice. 6 months later, the Manhattan Criminal Court unveiled a new Veterans Intervention Program, designed specifically to identify veterans in the criminal justice system and connect them with services before formal charges. Judge Harrison, now heading the program, had insisted on data collection by race and gender to monitor for disparities in treatment or outcomes. Brayton, now housed and receiving proper medical care including treatment for PTSD, had become a consultant for the program. 3 days a week, he sat in courtrooms identifying potential veterans whom the system might otherwise process without recognizing their service or needs. The uniform comes off, he explained to a group of judicial clerks during a training session, but the service never ends. And neither should the country's obligation to those who served, regardless of what they look like or where they sleep. His story had sparked a Department of Justice investigation into systematic disparities in veteran benefit administration, leading to new accountability measures and revised protocols for processing applications. The preliminary findings confirmed what Brayton had experienced, a pattern of delayed or denied benefits that disproportionately affected veterans of color. On Veterans Day, Brayton stood at a podium outside the VA hospital where Lisa had once been denied timely diagnosis. He wore a new suit, his silver star pinned to his lapel, addressing a gathering that included military officials, community leaders, and dozens of formerly homeless veterans who had been identified through the new court program. I stand here today not as an exceptional case, but as evidence of a broken system, he began. My story made headlines because a judge recognized me. But what about those who serve honorably and return home to find that their country doesn't recognize them because of the color of their skin? The crowd grew silent as he continued. True patriotism isn't just about serving your country in war. It's about ensuring your country serves all its people in peace, especially those who sacrificed most for its principles. Among those listening was Officer Terrell, the young policeman who had once shown Brayton compassion on the street. Now assigned to community outreach, Terrell had become a crucial bridge between law enforcement and veteran services. My wife Lisa used to tell me, "Don't let this break your spirit. Someone still needs your light," Brayton concluded. Today, I understand what she meant. The light isn't just mine to keep. It's mine to share, to illuminate dark corners of a system that leaves too many behind. As he stepped away from the microphone, Judge Harrison approached, extending his hand. The two men, once linked by a battlefield rescue, now connected by a shared mission for justice, stood together, a living testament to what becomes possible when we truly see each other's humanity. Later that evening, Brayton visited Lisa's grave for the first time since becoming homeless. He placed fresh flowers beside the headstone and sat in peaceful silence as dusk settled around him. "You were right, Lisa," he whispered. "The world still needed my light. But what you didn't tell me was how much I would need the light of others to find my way back." He placed his hand on the cool marble. "I'm keeping my promise. Not just surviving, but making sure others don't have to fight the battles I fought alone." As darkness fell, Brayton stood and straightened his posture. Not the rigid military bearing of his past, but the dignified stance of a man who had reclaimed his place in a world that had once rendered him invisible. "Justice delayed is still justice," he said to the night air. "And I'm just getting started." Some say justice is blind, but too often, it simply turns a blind eye to those society has already forgotten. Brayton Green's story reminds us that every person deserves to be seen, not just for who they were or what they did, but for their inherent dignity as human beings. Has the story moved you? Made you think differently about the veterans you pass on the street or the assumptions we make based on appearance? Subscribe now to join our community committed to sharing these powerful truths and working toward a justice system that truly serves everyone equally. Remember, visibility is the first step toward justice. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.